But under our Constitution, race is irrelevant, as the court acknowledges. In fact, all racial categories are little more than stereotypes, suggesting that immutable characteristics somehow conclusively determine a person's ideology, beliefs, and abilities. Of course, that is false. Yes. When I talked with Anna last Side Chat Saturday, this was a point that I made. It's not often that I end up recording to put something out on a Monday, but unless you were under a rock, you probably heard last Thursday that the Supreme Court issued quite a major ruling in in the case of students for affordable admissions versus students for fair admissions versus Harvard and UNC, University of North Carolina, and basically struck down the use of affirmative action in college admissions. In particular, basically, as the College Fix indicates here, the U.S. Supreme Court on Thursday, June 29th, 2023, overturned the use of affirmative action in higher education, outlawing college admissions decisions based on an applicant's race. The development came through two landmark decisions ruling in favor of the plaintiffs in a pair of cases that targeted these policies at the University of North Carolina and Harvard University. Writing for the majority, Chief Roberts concluded, okay, I don't want to wade too much into that in this article, because as is my usual kind of thing when Supreme Court decisions come down because of lack of trust to a degree of news media myself, I do have on hand the full opinion, and I will link that in the description of this video for you. And I very strongly suggest you go read it. If nothing else, read the synopsis, but then also skip ahead a bit and read the concurring opinion written by Justice Clarence Thomas, because I do very much think that it is a very masterfully written concurring opinion with that, and really does rip apart a significant portion of the arguments. He actually focuses a lot of his time on ripping apart the dissenting opinion. Well, not a lot of his time. He focuses some of his time in ripping apart the dissenting opinion from Ketanji Brown Jackson, or Justice Brown Jackson, I should say. So it's certainly very interesting. I encourage you to read it. Of course, I'm talking about this because why? Universities are the place where we train the next generation of scientists. So this does actually have some distinct things that matter for the scientific world, for sure. And I think it would be no surprise to many of the viewers of this channel that I was a fan of seeing this ruling come out. And so I think we should get into it a little bit. And I also want to talk about things like this because Scientific American, of course, came out with their commentary, just bringing up a 2022 opinion, claiming it as a scientist's responsibility to combat racism, which I'm going to go look at that opinion here too while we're here. This may be a little bit of a longer video than I normally do, just because there's a lot around this. The other group that apparently decided they had to condemn having racial discrimination in college admissions is the American Association of University Professors. Oh, goodness. Which we'll get into their statement, too. But the first place I want to go is right here. None other than the text itself from the October 2022 term, decided on June 29th, 2023. It was argued on, Halloween last year. But there's a few things I want to point out here, and we'll go back and forth between this and, in particular, this statement from the American Association of University Professors, which seems to echo somewhat The it echoes somewhat the basic reaction that has been from a lot of universities, and I think I retweeted it at one point, and I forget exactly who said it, but basically from Harvard's own statement reacting to the ruling, they seem intent on flouting the ruling of the Supreme Court, which I think is congratulations. That's a very bad idea. But we shall see here. So, and we're actually going to start here because there's a point that I want to make here that has to do with this that with the ruling itself that we will see momentarily. Higher ed community must protect equity in education. I'm going to say it flat out right here. The AAUP does not speak for all university faculty. I've heard from a number that don't appreciate the statement. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision today, being Thursday, in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and Students for Fair Admissions versus University of North Carolina is a significant blow to long-standing efforts of universities to ensure that students of all races have equal access to higher education. Despite the setback, AAUP continues its fight for a more just and equitable society, one in which all students have a full and fair opportunity to receive a quality education and contribute to the academic life of America's colleges and universities. So, one of the reasons that I'm actually pretty pleased to see affirmative action go down is because it's not affirmative action never really addressed a problem. I've talked about this in the past. At the moment, right now, a quarter of high school students are proficient in math and science, less than a quarter, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, puts up the nation's report card. That's for high school seniors, graduating high school seniors. The other one that came out recently was 13-year-olds' recent assessment. Really, really degraded quality, really, really degraded ability in math, in part because of the pandemic, but also because of other things, so that of other things going on. I would very much like to see the schooling situation in K through 12 be improved, because that would improve your ability. It would improve everybody's ability to have access to higher education. That is a problem that affirmative action does not address, and it never will. So I want to get into this here and eventually too, because I will say the AAUP statement here, and I'm ignoring this because it's the court regardless. All right. Although the court majority recognized that the educational benefits that flow from achieving a diverse student body are, quote, commendable goals, it found that Harvard and UNC failed to meet their burden of demonstrating that their admissions programs achieve compelling interest through narrowly tailored means. The majority also noted, however, that nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. I pause here because I note that AAUP, Harvard did this too, AAUP does not recognize the end of that section in the opinion. There's actually something very, very crucial that came immediately after that section in the opinion that I think one needs to recognize. Let's see. And we're going to get into that in a minute. There's not too much else here. Today's ruling came in response to a pair of lawsuits brought against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina by the Students for Fair Admissions, an organization dedicated to overturning race-conscious admissions policies. That's incorrect. That is an incorrect statement for what that group is about. The admissions policies at both universities conform to the Supreme Court's precedents allowing applicants' race to be considered as part of a holistic evaluation process. The problem is it wasn't holistic. In an amicus brief filed with the Supreme Court in support of Harvard and UNC, the AAUP and other groups outlined how race-conscious admissions policies can further the educational objectives of the college and university and discuss the importance of a racially diverse student body. In the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision, it now falls to the higher education community to protect what we value, ensuring access to higher education for all students, promoting equity education, fostering vibrant university campuses characterized by the freedom to learn, teach, and conduct research. The AAUP maintains the commitment to the crucial goal of ensuring that a diverse range of students have access to America's colleges and universities. The AAUP pledges to work with faculty, college, and university administrators and social justice organizations, proving to me that you are not neutral in this at all, and you are not necessarily representing diverse viewpoints, but that's a whole other thing, to make this goal a reality. Okay. Now I want to get into some of the things with the thing here, but one point with the opinion, I mean, but one of the things I want to point out with this is that protect what we value. This is again why I say AAUP does not reflect what all faculty think. And that should be very highly noted, that they nowhere near reflect what all faculty think. Because frankly, for me and for others, the telos of a university is about pursuing the truth, not about social justice narratives. Now, to the opinion itself. I'm going to read from a few different chunks of the opinion, probably mostly from the syllabus, some from the actual full opinion itself. This thing is a tome because it's 237 pages, but there's some things here of importance that I think one can get into with this. Harvard and the University of North Carolina are two of the oldest institutions of higher learning in the United States. Every year, tens of thousands of students apply to each school. Many fewer are admitted. Both Harvard and UNC employ a highly selective admissions process to make their decisions. Admission to each school can depend on a student's grades, recommendation letters, or extracurricular involvement. It can also depend on their race. The question presented is whether the admission system used by Harvard College and UNC are lawful under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. At Harvard, each application for admission is initially screened by a first reader who assigns a numerical score in each of the 6 categories: academic, extracurricular, athletic, school support, personal, and overall. For the overall category, composite of 5 other ratings, a first reader can and does consider the applicant's race. Harvard's admissions subcommittees then review all applications from a particular geographic area. These regional subcommittees, okay. So the first part of this here is primarily the description of the process. Petitioner Students for Fair Admissions is a nonprofit organization whose stated purpose is to, quote, defend human and civil rights secured by law, including the right of individuals to equal protection under the law. SFFA filed separate lawsuits against Harvard and UNC, arguing that their race-based admissions programs violate, respectively, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. After separate bench trials, both admissions programs were found permissible under the Equal Protection Clause and this court's precedents. In the Harvard case, the First Circuit affirmed, and this court granted certiorari. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but anyway. In the UNC case, this court granted certiorari before judgment. Held, right here, Harvard and UNC's admissions programs violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Because SFFA complies with the standing requirements for organizational plaintiffs articulated by this court, which is just saying some, let's see, court rejects. Okay. Now, yeah, we get into some of the fundamental things here. So, what they always do with these opinions is they will lay out a lot of history. And in the syllabus, it's the summarized version. In the opinion, it's the full-on glorious version of everything. So if you want a real history lesson in terms of the legal history of the United States, these are great things to read when one of these kinds of decisions come out. Let's see. After Plessy v. Ferguson, American courts labored with the doctrine of separate but equal for half a century. So some cases in this period attempted to curtail the perniciousness of this doctrine by emphasizing that it required states to provide black students equal educational opportunities equal to, even if formally separate from, those enjoyed by white students. But the inherent folly of that approach of trying to derive equality from inequality soon became apparent, as the court subsequently recognized even racial distinctions that were argued to have no palpable effect worked to subordinate the afflicted students. McLaurin versus the Oklahoma State Regents for Higher Ed. By 1950, the inevitable truth of the 14th Amendment had thus begun to reemerge. Separate cannot be equal. Culmination of this approach came finally in Brown v. Board of Education. There, the court overturned the separate but equal regime established in Plessy v. Ferguson and began on a path of invalidating all de jure racial discrimination by the states and the federal government. The conclusion reached by the Brown court was unmistakably clear. The right to a public education, quote, must be made available to all on equal terms. The court reiterated that rule just 1 year later, holding that full compliance with Brown required schools to admit students on a racially non-discriminatory basis. Long history. In the years that followed, Brown's fundamental principle that racial discrimination in public education is unconstitutional reached other areas of life. For example, state and local laws requiring segregation on busing, Gale versus Browder, racial segregation in the enjoyment of public beaches and bathhouses, Mayor and City Council of Baltimore versus Dawson, and anti-miscegenation laws, Loving v. Virginia. These decisions and others like them reflect the core purpose of the Equal Protection Clause, doing away with governmentally imposed discrimination based on race. Eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. Accordingly, the court has held that the Equal Protection Clause applies, quote, without regard to any differences of race, of color, or of nationality. It is universal in its application. Yick-Woe versus Hopkins. For the guarantee of equal protection cannot mean one thing when applied to one individual and something else when applied to a person of another color. Regents of the University of California versus Backey. Backey was the Backey case was the original case that started a whole lot of the affirmative action related stuff way back in the day, in the 70s, I believe. Any exceptions to the Equal Protection Clause's guarantee must survive a daunting two-step examination known as strict scrutiny. Grutter versus Bollinger and second whether... Wait a second. Adaran versus Piana, I did not pronounce that right, which asks whether reason that's further compelling governmental interests. Fisher versus University of Texas, Austin. So Greta versus Bollinger in second. Yeah, okay. The strict. Okay, now I know what this is about. This is all just saying these are the cases that set up the strict scrutiny standard. Acceptance of race-based state action is rare for a reason. Distinctions between citizens solely because of their ancestry are by their very nature odious to a free people whose institutions are founded on the doctrine of equality. So, let me go down here. Let's see. Yes. Greta v. Bollinger was one of the key ones, actually, in this whole history surrounding affirmative action in higher education. And Sandra Day O'Connor, when she wrote the opinion back then, made it very clear that race-based admissions in universities would have to at some point end. There needed to be a limiting principle. To manage these concerns, Grutter imposed one final limit on race-based admissions programs. At some point, the court held they must end, recognizing that, quote, enshrining a permanent justification for racial preferences would offend the Constitution's unambiguous guarantee of equal protection. The court expressed its expectation that, in 25 years, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today. Which was allowing... Greta v. Bollinger was the last really serious challenge to affirmative action before now, and that was 20 years ago. And that's actually what they note next, is that 20 years have passed since Grutter, with no end to race-based college admissions in sight. But the court has permitted race-based college admissions only within the confines of narrow restrictions. Such admissions must comply with strict scrutiny, may never use race as a stereotype or negative, and must at some point end. Respondents' admissions systems fail each of these criteria and must therefore be unvalidated under the Equal Protection Clause. And this is actually where they point out and think here. Big problem at the start, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but respondents fail to operate their race-based admissions programs in a manner that is sufficiently measurable to permit judicial review under the rubric of strict scrutiny. More details on that momentarily. Respondents' race-based admissions system also fails to comply with the Equal Protection Clause twinned commands that race may never be used as a negative and that it may not operate as a stereotype. The First Circuit found that Harvard's consideration of race has resulted in fewer admissions of Asian American students. Respondents' assertion that race is never a negative factor in their admissions programs cannot withstand scrutiny. College admissions are zero-sum, and a benefit provided to some applicants but not to others necessarily advantages the former at the expense of the latter. Respondents' admissions program also lack a logical endpoint as Grutter requires. Now, here's the particular noting thing here. Because Harvard and UNC's admissions programs lack sufficiently focused and measurable objectives warranting the use of race, unavoidably employ race in a negative manner, involve racial stereotyping, and lack meaningful endpoints, those admissions programs cannot be reconciled with the guarantees of the Equal Protection Clause. At the same time, nothing prohibits universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race has affected the applicant's life, so long as that discussion is concretely tied to a quality of character or unique ability that the particular applicant can contribute to the university. Many universities have for too long wrongly concluded that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. This nation's constitutional history does not tolerate that choice. Now, you might recognize this thing here about the same thing, what have you. This is from the syllabus. That's repeated, actually, in the full opinion, and I want to go find it because there's a key point there that I think Harvard, amongst others, are ignoring in this. And so, I hope I can find it quickly. I highlighted it. Question of where it is exactly. Oh, wait. Yes. Oh, yeah, this is actually the section where their first interests they view as compelling cannot be subjected to meaningful review. Yeah, so because racial discrimination is invidious in all contexts, we have required that universities operate their race-based admissions program in a manner that is sufficiently measurable to permit judicial review under the rubric of strict scrutiny. Classifying and assigning students based on their race requires more than an amorphous end to justify it. Respondents have fallen short of satisfying that burden. First, the interests they view as compelling cannot be subjected to meaningful judicial review. Harvard identifies the following educational benefits that it is pursuing: training future leaders in the public and private sectors, preparing graduates to adapt to increasingly pluralistic society, better educating its students through diversity, and producing new knowledge stemming from diverse outlooks. UNC has a similar kind of thing. What they go on to say in this whole section here, and again, I encourage you to go read it, is basically these things that UNC says is good. There's no real way to measure it in terms of your success. So how can we actually oversee it? There is no strict category. For starters, the categories themselves are imprecise. Indeed, the use of these opaque racial categories undermines instead of promotes the respondents' goals by focusing on underrepresentation. This is actually talking about how it would also be a negative. By focusing on underrepresentation, respondents would apparently prefer a class with 15% of students from Mexico over a class of 10% of students from several Latin American countries, simply because the former contains more Hispanic students than the latter. Yet it is hard to understand how a plan that could allow these results to be viewed as being concerned with achieving enrollment that is broadly diverse. And given the mismatch between the means the respondents employ and the goals they seek, it is especially hard to understand how courts are supposed to scrutinize the admissions programs that respondents use. The main university, this is fun to read right here. The university's main response to these criticisms is essentially, trust us. None of the questions recited above need answering, they say, because universities are owed deference when using race to benefit some applicants but not others. Brief for the university respondents. It is true that our cases have recognized a tradition of giving a degree of deference to the university's academic decisions, but we have been unmistakably clear that any deference must exist within constitutionally prescribed limits, and that deference does not imply the abandonment or abdication of judicial review. Universities may define their missions as they see fit. The Constitution defines ours. Courts may not license separating students on the basis of race without an exceedingly persuasive justification that is measurable and concrete enough to permit judicial review. As this court has repeatedly affirmed, racial classifications are simply too pernicious to permit any but the most exact connection between justification and classification. The programs at issue do not satisfy that standard. The race-based admissions that respondents employ also fail to comply with the twin commands of the Equal Protection Clause that race may never be used as a negative and that it may not operate as a stereotype. So that whole section in here, section B, is talking about that second point. By accepting race-based admissions programs in which some students may obtain preferences on the basis of race alone, respondents' programs tolerate the very thing that Grutter forswore, stereotyping. The point of respondents' admissions programs is that there is an inherent benefit to race qua race in race for race's sake. Respondents admitted as much. Harvard's admission process rests on the pernicious stereotype that, quote, and this is Harvard, not me, not the court, this is Harvard. A black student can usually bring something that a white student cannot offer. Oy. UNC is much the same. It argues that race in itself says something about who you are. We have time and again forcefully rejected the notion that government actors may intentionally allocate preference to those, quote, who may have little in common with one another but the color of their skin. The entire point of the Equal Protection Clause is that treating someone differently because of their skin color is not like treating them differently because they are from a city or from a suburb, or because they play the violin poorly or well. One of the principal reasons race is treated as a forbidden classification is that it demeans the dignity and worth of a person to be judged by ancestry instead of his or her own merit and essential qualities. But when a university admits students on the basis of race, it engages in the offensive and demeaning assumption, I missed this. It engages in the offensive and demeaning assumption that students of a particular race, because of their race, think alike. One of the reasons I don't like affirmative action. Okay, no logical endpoint. That's the last one. Where is the thing I was actually looking for, though? Because there is a point in here. One of the things they do also in the opinion is they rip apart the arguments in the dissent, because one of the reasons it takes so long for these opinions to be made available and for them to come out and know what the court is actually saying is because they are arguing back and forth internally for a while in that court. Here we go. For the reasons provided above, the Harvard and UNC admissions programs cannot be reconciled with the guarantees of the Equal Protection Clause. Both programs lack sufficiently focused and measurable objectives warranting the use of race, unavoidably employ race in a negative manner, involve racial stereotyping, and lack meaningful endpoints. We have never permitted admissions programs to work in that way, and we will not do so today. Here's the key point. Here's the key point I was looking for. At the same time, as all parties agree, nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. But here's the key point that the AAUP, that Harvard, that a whole bunch of people are ignoring. But despite the dissent's assertion to the contrary, universities may not simply establish through application essays or other means the regime we hold unlawful today. Which is to say, no, you cannot demand students tell you about their race in applications. You cannot go and implement it by other means either. It's flat out wrong to discriminate on the basis of race in college admissions, whether to the positive or to the negative. Not that it's really a positive, but anyway. A dissenting opinion is generally not the best source of information, the best source of legal advice, on how to comply with majority opinion. What cannot be done directly cannot be done indirectly. The Constitution deals with substance, not shadows, and the prohibition against racial discrimination is, quote, leveled at the thing, not the name. A benefit to a student who overcame racial discrimination, for example, must be tied to that student's courage and determination. Or a benefit to a student whose heritage or culture motivated him or her to assume a leadership role or attain a particular goal must be tied to that student's unique ability to contribute to the university. In other words, the student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. Many universities have for too long done just the opposite, and in doing so, they have concluded wrongly that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Our constitutional history does not tolerate that choice. The judgments of the Court of Appeals for the First Circuit and of the District Court for the Middle District of North Carolina are reversed. It is so ordered. That is the ending of the full opinion, but that is the reason I wanted to bring this up. This whole section right here, specifically this, is a note to everybody who wants to do an end run around the court's opinion and what the court has ruled, that the court's not going to put up with that. That the court's going to say that that's just as unconstitutional if you do it by other means as by the method that you did it now. So I suspect there may very well be more lawsuits related to this, but that's why I wanted to bring this particular thing up, is because I know what's being said right here is basically a cue to, oh, well, we can just get students to talk about their race for them, and then we can figure it out and get who we want. No, you cannot do that. You absolutely cannot do that. If the student volunteers that information, that's another thing. But I don't think you can go ahead and just say, oh, tell us about XYZ thing. Okay, so there's that. The following one here this starts on page 49 of the long PDF. But this is the concurring opinion of Justice Clarence Thomas on this thing. And my goodness gravy almighty, if you haven't read it, go read it, because it's fabulous. In here. So, he goes into great depth, actually, and so I'm not going to read through all of this just now, but I do want to hit on a few points. There was something that was worth reading through that I did want to bring up because it's so well done. In fact, there's a few things. I like Justice Clarence Thomas in that he is, for the most part, brief and straight to the point, but also understands the history. Understands the history very well. Let's see. And he pulls no punches, actually, with this. In an effort to salvage their patently unconstitutional programs, the universities and their amici, I don't know how to pronounce that, pivot to argue that the 14th Amendment permits the use of race to benefit only certain racial groups rather than applicants writ large. Yet this is just the latest disguise for discrimination. The sudden narrative shift is not surprising, as it has long been apparent that, quote, diversity was merely the current rationale of convenience to support racial discriminatory admissions programs. Under our precedents, this new rationale is also lacking. To start, the case for affirmative action has emphasized a number of rationales over the years, including 1. Restitution to compensate those who've been victimized by past discrimination, fostering diversity, facilitating integration and the destruction of perceived racial castes, and countering long-standing and diffuse racial prejudice. Again, this court has only recognized one interest as compelling: the educational benefits of diversity embraced by Grutter v. Bollinger. Yet, as universities define diversity that they practice, it encompasses social and aesthetic goals far afield from the education-based interests discussed in Grutter. This dissents to attempt to stretch the diversity rationale, suggesting that it supports broad remedial interests. Let's see. Broad remedial interests. Noting that, percentages. Yeah. That's the dissent from Justice Sotomayor. That's the dissent from Justice Jackson. But the language, particularly the language of the controlling opinions of this court, is not so elastic. Where is it? Oh. This I found particularly interesting, actually, because he has the right idea. Indeed, if our history has taught us anything, it has taught us to beware of elites bearing racial theories. We cannot now blink reality to pretend, as the dissents urge, that affirmative action should be legally permissible because the experts assure us that it is good for Black students. Though I do not doubt the sincerity of my dissenting colleagues' beliefs, experts and elites have been wrong before, and they may prove to be wrong again. For this reason, the 14th Amendment outlaws government-sanctioned racial discrimination of all types. The stakes are simply too high to gamble. Then as now, the views that motivated Dred Scott and Plessy have not been confined to the past, and we must remain ever vigilant against all forms of racial discrimination. Now, I wanted to mention this particular thing because Justice Thomas has a very good point. And this goes back to, I've said this a few times with respect to Scientific American and Nature and what have you, that the purpose of the court and the purpose of science are two different things. And in particular, this is the lineup of whether or not it falls within the purview of the universities to do this, which they have ruled is unconstitutional. That is the job of the court to determine that. And his point here that sometimes just taking the word of experts, you can't use experts to necessarily satisfy a standard for strict scrutiny, perhaps. And so, yeah, you should take into account expert testimony. And of course you should take into account the testimony of scientists and what have you. But that is not the only, you should not just merely defer to that as the only thing, particularly when you're making decisions about the law. And that is one of the points that he gets at here is, no, just to trust us, this will be good. No. There's a long section. Where is it? Here it is. Let's see. Far from advancing the cause of improved race relations in our nations, affirmative action highlights our racial differences with pernicious effect. In fact, recent history reveals a disturbing pattern. Affirmative action policies appear to have prolonged the asserted need for racial discrimination. Parties and embassy in these cases report that, in nearly 50 years since Bakke, racial progress on campuses adopting affirmative action admissions policies has stagnated, including making no meaningful progress toward a colorblind goal since Grutter. Rather, the legacy of Grutter appears to be an ever-increasing and strident demands for yet more racially oriented solutions. It has become clear that sorting by race does not stop at the admissions office. In his Grutter opinion, Justice Scalia criticized universities for talking of multiculturalism and racial diversity, but supporting tribalism and racial segregation on their campuses, including through minority-only student organizations, separate minority housing opportunities, separate minority student centers, even separate minority-only graduation ceremonies. This trend has hardly abated with time, and today such programs are commonplace. In fact, a recent study considering 173 schools found that 43% of colleges offer segregated housing to students of different races, 46% offer segregated orientation programs, and 72% offer sponsored segregated graduation ceremonies. In addition to contradicting the university's claims regarding the need for interracial interaction. What? Wait, what? I'm. Oh, yeah. These trends increasingly encourage our nation's youth to view racial differences as important and segregation as routine. In other words, the such things as Justice Thomas is pointing out here is apparently making race matter more, not less, and fostering a lot of negative things. In the standpoint of science, this is quite the opposite of the principle of universalism, where your race should not matter in your ability as a scientist. This is one of the reasons I'm talking about this, is you're fostering a mindset where these things do matter. You're inherently fostering a mindset where, well, you're going to have a problem with the universalism side of doing science. Meanwhile, these discriminatory policies risk creating new prejudices and allowing old ones to fester. I previously observed that there can be no doubt that discriminatory affirmative action policies injure white and Asian applicants who are denied admission because of their race. Petitioner here clearly demonstrates this fact. Moreover, no social science has disproved the notion that this discrimination engenders attitudes of superiority, or alternatively provokes resentment among those who believe that they have been wronged by the government's use of race. Applicants denied admission to certain colleges may come to believe, accurately or not, that their race was responsible for their failure to attain a lifelong dream. These individuals and others who wish for their success may resent members of what they perceive to be favored races, believing that the successes of those individuals are unearned. What then would be the endpoint of these affirmative action policies? Not racial harmony, integration, or equality under the law. Rather, these policies appear to be leading to a world in which everyone is defined by their skin color, demanding ever-increasing entitlements and preferences on that basis. Not exactly the kind of factionalism that the Constitution was meant to safeguard against, but it is a factionalism based on ever-shifting sands. That is because race is a social construct. We may each identify as members of particular races for any number of reasons, having to do with our skin color, our heritage, or our cultural identity. And over time, these ephemeral, socially constructed categories have often shifted. For example, whereas universities today would group all white applicants together, white elites previously sought to exclude Jews and other white immigrant groups from higher education. In fact, it is impossible to look at an individual and know definitively his or her race. Some who would consider themselves black, for example, may be quite fair-skinned. Yet, university admissions policies ask individuals to identify themselves as belonging to one of only a few reductionist racial groups, with boxes for only black, white, Hispanic, Asian, or the ambiguous other. How is a Middle Eastern person to choose? Someone from the Philippines. Whichever choice he makes, in the event he chooses to report race at all, the form silos him into an official category. Worse, it sends a clear signal that category matters. Again, the notion that there's a reason I'm reading this is what Clarence Thomas is talking about is something I do get worried about with some of this myself when we're teaching the next generation of scientists, in that if you're teaching that race matters in all these kinds of things, then you're teaching something that goes against the Mertonian norm of universalism, where your race actually does not matter at all when you're doing science. That's the thing. You don't want to have countervening things. You need to actually put that together. Take a look at that. You need to actually make sure that race doesn't matter. But under our Constitution, race is irrelevant, as the court acknowledges. In fact, all racial categories are little more than stereotypes, suggesting that immutable characteristics somehow conclusively determine a person's ideology, beliefs, and abilities. Of course, that is false. Yes. When I talked with Anna on last Side Chat Saturday, this was a point that I made, that a lot of the things that the universities seem to put together as diversity are really just skin deep, meaning they make that assumption that Justice Thomas just ripped apart. That's one of the reasons I'm happy to see affirmative action go. Members of the same race do not all share the exact same experiences and viewpoints. Far from it. A black person from rural Alabama surely has different experiences than a black person from Manhattan or a black first-generation immigrant from Nigeria, in the same way that a white person from rural Vermont has a different perspective than a white person from Houston, Texas. Yet universities' racial policies suggest that racial identity alone constitutes the being of the race or the man. That is the same naked racism upon which segregation itself was built. Small wonder, then, that these policies are leading to increasing racial polarization and friction. This kind of reductionist logic leads directly to the, quote, disregard for what does not jibe with preconceived theory, providing a cloak to conceal complexity, argument to the crown for praising or damning without the trouble of going into details, such as details about an individual's ideas or unique background. Rather than forming a more pluralistic society, these policies, again, affirmative action is what he's referring to, thus strip us of our individuality and seek and undermine the very diversity of thought that universities purport to seek. Oh gosh, I love this section. There's a reason I'm reading this, is because this lines up very much for those of us who are very much about defending diversity of thought. This whole section here lines up quite nicely with that. And again, it really focuses heavily on the Mertonian norm of universalism with respect to science. It very much undergirds a lot of that. That kind of thinking that your race does not matter is an important part of that with universalism. No. That your thought matters. Your perspective matters. Your perspective being formed by a huge number of things. The solution to our nation's racial problems thus cannot come from policies grounded in affirmative action or some other conception of equity. Racialism simply cannot be undone by different or more racialism, which is it's a longer way of saying you can't fix racism with more racism. Instead, the solution announced in the second founding is incorporated in our Constitution, that we are all equal and should be treated equally before the law without regard to our race. Same way with scientists. Only that promise can allow us to look past our differing skin colors and identities and see each other for what we truly are, individuals with unique thoughts, perspectives, and goals, but with equal dignity and equal rights under the law. Now, I'm not going to go into too much depth with this next part because this is already getting to be a long video, but as you note here, this whole section after that is where he takes apart the dissent from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. In which case, in her dissent, she argues that because disparities exist, therefore we must have affirmative action, is essentially what she argues. It is a really poor, really poor kind of thing here. It's actually this section where he highlights the same thing that the authors of In Defense of Merit highlighted, that merit actually does help. Let's see. This is the closing of his concurrence, and this is one thing I did want to read. The great failure of this country was slavery and its progeny. And the tragic failure of this court was its misinterpretation of the Reconstruction Amendments as Justice Harlan predicted in Plessy. We should not repeat this mistake merely because we think, as our predecessors thought, that the present arrangements are superior to the Constitution. The court's opinion rightly makes clear that Grutter is, for all intents and purposes, overruled. And it sees the university's admission policies for what they are: rudderless, race-based preferences designed to ensure a particular racial mix in their entering classes. Those policies fly in the face of our colorblind Constitution and our nation's equality ideal. In short, they are plainly and boldly unconstitutional. While I am painfully aware of the social and economic ravages which have befallen my race and all who suffer discrimination, I hold out enduring hope that this country will live up to its principles so clearly enunciated in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, that all men are created equal, are equal citizens, and must be treated equally before the law. Bravo, Justice Thomas. This is a fabulous concurring opinion, and again, I encourage you to go read it. It's about 50 pages long by itself in the tome here, so I suggest going to go read that. But all of this is one of the reasons I read all of that particular earlier section had to do with the notions of universalism. I'm very cognizant that our undergraduate students who are going into STEM fields have to deal with a lot of messaging and what have you. And if the messaging primarily to them is that they're getting in not that they're getting in, is that race matters in all of this, that race matters, that sex matters, and what have you, that, you're not a unique individual, you're just a member of a racial group or something along that line. That really actually does not help with the norm of universalism in science. It does not help students recognize their potential, that their unique perspective matters, and that their unique perspective can lead to some really creative and innovative research. Diversity of thought, free speech, and academic freedom, all of that matters to me and together, because those are the kinds of things that lead to the truly most wonderful, fabulous, innovative research that advances our knowledge base in the purpose and primary goal of pursuing the truth, but it also helps to solve some of the most complicated problems that exist in society, regardless of the nature of the problem. And that's the kind of things that we need, is respect for diversity of thought and our common humanity, while embracing the very, very unique individuals that we are. Treating people as individuals is miles ahead of treating people as members of groups. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrienne. May you stay curious, everybody.